Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mark, and this is Several Books. Today we're going to be looking at Saul Bellow. Saul Bellow is an American writer. I think of him as being somewhat similar in terms of stature as a William Faulkner. I understand that's a huge claim. What I want to do is draw a distinction between Bellow and Hemingway as the counterpart to Faulkner. Although Hemingway, at the time of Faulkner, was doing essentially the opposite, what Bellow then did was reinvigorate writing. In the words of Philip Roth, Hemingway boxed up the American sentence or put a cap on it, and what Bellow did was to set it free and liberate it. Through picaresque novels, he essentially describes the American experience. For Saul Bellow, being an American is of the utmost concern. It's interesting to him, and in his novels, he uses characters that are clearly based on American political figures such as presidents. What I hope to do here is maybe interest some people in Saul Bellow. Where I would start is say that Hemingway we all know as a certain type of modern artist who tended to work more at a miniature scale. I'm not saying Hemingway was a miniaturist as such, but aside from For Whom the Bell Tolls, the average length of his novels is about 200 pages. Saul Bellow, on the other hand, is more like a Tolstoyan or Dostoevskian character. His books concerned with what it means to be American bear close resemblance to Tolstoy and Dostoevsky's concern with what it means to be Russian and the Russian soul. I think that Saul Bellow is more than worth your time. And so what I'm hoping is that after watching this, you might consider picking up one of his books. To start with Saul Bellow, we're going to take a look at Dangling Man. Dangling Man was first published in 1944. The book tells the story of a man who is being enlisted in the military, and he's waiting for his shipment date. The novel is mostly told as if it's a journal, and we get chapter titles that are dates. Generally, I would describe the writing as enthusiastic and energetic. There are sections of dialogue, but they appear a bit differently in Bellow than I would expect from Hemingway. In Hemingway, I frequently expect long lists of dialogue. In Bellow, we're often interrupted to reminisce. Bellow tends to do a very good job of building character through this type of reflective technique. His main interest in his books is what characters think, and he does a great job of exploring their thoughts. There are further certain things that he's beginning to show interest in Dangling Man that will develop more and more later in his work. One thing about Saul Bellow is that he was interested in theosophy. Essentially, he thought that people's personal characteristics could be shown, in a sense, through their physical manifestation. And so we'll get characters who have haircuts in certain ways that exhibit certain types of personalities. we'll get descriptions of physical appearance, such as a nose, a mouth, a chin, a beard, that will also tell us something about the characters. This builds the sense that Bellow was writing from maybe another time. He's giving us these classical appearances and these classical descriptions. My thoughts on Dangling Man are that the book should probably be ignored by most people. When we read Bellow, we have to make allowances for the epoch in which he was writing. Bellow was a very flawed man. When he was dying in old age, he said that he hoped people remembered him as a man, meaning as somebody flawed, and not as a jerk. I think not everybody who watches this video will think that Bellow was not a jerk. There are bound to be some who will just dislike every part of him. But on the whole, I think he's definitely worth looking into. It's just that maybe Dangling Man is a book worth glancing over. On a scale from S to F tier, I would rank Dangling Man as being either a D or an F. I'm going to say one specific scene, and I think that will explain why it is that I don't like Dangling Man. That specific scene is that the main character is talking to his wife, and he feels that his wife is misbehaving. And in that scene, he spanks his wife. So this is something that clearly we wouldn't consider appropriate today. And we would have to assume that most people living today would not behave in this way. Having kind of shown Bellow's dirty laundry with this book, I hope that you will consider continuing to watch, and we can talk about books that may interest you more. So D to F. First novel, terrible showing, to be honest. With Bellow's second novel, The Victim, we begin to see a much more modern person. Bellow's sexism, which is prevalent in his novels, is much less on display, and so it's easier to like him. The Victim has been described as a Kafkaesque story wherein a man essentially sponges off a man and his wife. A character who is claiming illness and other problems shows up at Ace's house or apartment and essentially just couch surfs there. Through various means, Asa tries to move the victim out of his dwelling. Of course, in the end of the book, he does succeed, but much of the book is built around this conflict. As I said, people consider the book Kafkaesque. I was reminded most of Dostoevsky when reading this book. To me, the reflections are similar to the reflections of Dostoevsky's Underground Man, for instance. What we're getting here is a man's man type character. Bellow was a man's man. But there's much more subtlety of emotion and feeling than we find in a Hemingway. So what I would rank this book at is a B. I would say this is a B to a B plus, somewhere in there, and that it's definitely worth checking out. Bellow's first S-tier novel, for me, is his National Book Award-winning The Adventures of Augie March. This book is great for so many reasons, but what I'm going to do is start out talking about myth and what it means to be an American. Bellow was very concerned with the idea of what it meant to be an American, and for a literary parallel, what I would do is draw attention again to Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. The same way that Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or even Chekhov was very concerned with the Russian soul, Saul Bellow essentially wrote books about what he thought it meant to be an American. This is the story of a Jewish man growing up in a poor Chicagoan neighborhood. His brother is differently abled, and it does concern him throughout about the first half of the novel. Around that time, the character of his brother is less important, as Augie, the principal character, is kind of off living his life. In this novel, we have multiple symbolic characters. There's a character, for instance, who reminds me very much of FDR. It's a very well-read businessman, wealthy businessman, and he's been reading in the classics. And one thing about Augie is that he's very interested in classic literature. And this is in contradistinction to Augie's neighborhood, the area where he grew up. So Augie you would expect to be a bit of a roughneck, a poor guy who's, a bit rowdy and such. And by contrast, what we're seeing is Augie be very contemplative, and he's concerned with ideas such as nobility. Essentially, like other realist novels, we see Augie in many different situations where he's seeing different parts of society kind of through a magnifying glass. We see Augie in different jobs that include everything from chauffeur to small-time book thief. And he even becomes involved with a Faulkner hawk trainer at one point, and seems to kind of adopt part of that as his work. The work is a picaresque novel, and there are a few pretty funny parts in here. I would say that the novel is a bit long, but aside from that, it's great. There are, as I said, mythical and symbolic characters, and Saul Bellow is very concerned with making his characters larger than life. So there are definitely people in this book who will leave an impression that is so great and lasting. I first read this book probably between 15 and 20 years ago. I remember it fairly well. The next book that we're working with is significantly shorter. Now, I think Saul Bellow works best in not necessarily the longest form, such as we get with Augie March, but a bit longer than short fiction. Seize the Day is primarily the day-to-day life of Tommy Wilhelm. And as with a lot of shorter realist novellas, Tommy goes to various areas and basically sees that society works in this function, in this capacity, in this type of environment. The main crux of the book for me is the final scene at a funeral, where he's at a random person's funeral. The book, what it concerns itself with is male friendship and a father-son type relationship. I think the book is okay. Truthfully, I don't remember it super well. I read most of Saul Bellow, except for two works, about 15 years ago, and this is one that I don't remember very well. Out of a sort of respect for Bellow and I guess educational programs in the US that will still teach this, I'm going to give this a B or a B minus. I think it's a decent book. It's a good afternoon read, but you're not missing really who Bellow is if you don't read this. I think the reason why Bellow retains the readership that he has is those longer works. The next book is a book that I like about as much as Augie March, and that's Henderson, the Rain King. In this book, a man who suspiciously resembles Teddy Roosevelt goes to Africa, and it's essentially a kind of midlife crisis. And this is a book that I think exhibits a type of coming-of-age story that made Bellow and later Philip Roth very famous. This is kind of, rather than the coming-of-age story, the coming-of-middle-age story. Although we get a lot of the trappings that turn people off about realist novels in this book, such as the divorced man who drinks too much, Henderson is a much more complicated character than that, with business successes and his safari in Africa. But what we see of Africa is a very interesting place. I think it's possible to read Bellow and say, I don't particularly approve of all of his characterizations of African people. There is definitely some of the noble savage in this book. But in general, the description is much more complicated than something you can simply write off. There's a scene in the beginning of the book where Henderson has met a tribe of people, and these people hold frogs sacred. Henderson blows up a well where these frogs, tadpoles, have been living. And of course it causes great concern. It's a very comic scene. I'm probably doing a terrible job of describing it. It's not something I can read, as the entire ordeal takes several pages. But there's something very comic and bold about it, and it feels cartoony in the best sort of way. It doesn't feel cartoony in the sense that you're watching something like South Park or The Simpsons. It's a much bolder kind of mythic occurrence. And that's the thing that really builds in Henderson the Rain King. So much of the book feels mythic in a way that not much fiction does. And I don't want to give anything really away about the book beyond what I already have. But there's a long section in the end of the book where Henderson compares a man who has become his friend. Male-to-male friendship is very important to Bellow, to a lion. And the comparison is absolutely beautiful. It's several pages. If you're not interested in the book by the time the comparison comes about, you're not going to care much about the comparison. But if you find the book interesting at all, by the time you get to the comparison, you're ready to see where Bellow is going. And it's a beautiful scene. Bellow's second National Book Award-winning novel is Herzog. And Herzog is an interesting book. Herzog is written where essentially each chapter or new space break is a letter of Herzog writing back in time to somebody. Not literally. He's essentially writing letters, and eventually he winds up writing letters. He's living alone in a cabin in the woods. You get a counting of all of his food, for instance. But he's kind of driving himself crazy. And what he's doing is he's writing these letters to various people, and eventually the people include great intellectuals. So I think there's a letter to Montaigne, for instance. That said, if you think of a book where writing a letter is going to be one of the primary modes of communication, not necessarily a wholly epistolary novel, you might think of something like Confederacy of Dunces, where Ignatius Reilly writes essays, and they're spaced between the chapters. In each chapter, you get some of Ignatius's conversation or somebody else's, and then you get an essay reflection. You don't get that in Herzog. The way Herzog is structured, it's not always entirely clear what is and isn't letter. You'll get in the beginning of a chapter a paragraph or two that looks like he was writing a letter to Montaigne, thinking that he can, for some reason, send a letter back in time to this great intellectual. And then after those few paragraphs, this story kind of comes back to Herzog, and we see more closely reflections on his life. Now, this is against the backdrop of post-war American fiction, which on BookTube, I assume, carries the stigma of being about alcoholics who are going through divorces. Bellow does not shy away from writing about his divorces. He did have 3 of them, I believe, or he had at least 3 wives. But the style with which this book is written makes that kind of story something wholly new. Again, there are parts of this book that exhibit Bellow's unfortunate sexism, but I think that what you'll find is that this is a great novel and well worth your time. It reads fairly quickly. It's only about 360 pages, so it's shorter than Augie March and likely to hold your attention a little better. Again, Augie March is a great novel, but it just might not quite do what you're thinking. It might be a little too much at times. Bellow's 3rd National Book Award winning novel was Mr. Sammler's Planet. So this is a nice old copy. Mr. Sammler's Planet is a novel about Holocaust survivor of World War II. I know that I love the book reading it. There are parts that are famously, let's call them prejudicial. There's a portrait in the beginning of the book of a black man that's unflattering. And one of the ways that the book is now marketed is that there is a jazz critic who writes an introduction to the book, who is a black man, basically saying, you know, kind of despite the beginning of this book, I think it's okay. I need to warn you about it. It's unescapable. Bellow, as I said, was flawed. He was a close friend of Ralph Waldo Ellison, but the book is arguably somewhat prejudicial. I don't think that if you read this book, you would think that this one part of the novel is so horrible. But it is there, and it will raise questions, definitely. Like, why is it that this only real main black character is portrayed this way? Other than that, the book tends to be criticized for that Mr. Sammler doesn't really seem quite like an Eastern European. He seems a bit too American. There are moments where it does seem like he's letting loose a bit, and so I think that criticism also holds true. That said, the book won a National Book Award when it was written. I don't remember it super well. All of Bellow, as I've said, it was read for me except for 2 books close to 20 years ago. But we've got a lot of we've got a lot of Bellow. We've got a lot of him in here. And if you're interested in literature about World War II, then this is worth reading. Just understand that maybe the portrayal of Sammler is a little unorthodox to how you portray the victims of the Nazis today. He's a bit more rambunctious and a bit more in your face. Bellow's next novel, after 3 National Book Award winners, was the Pulitzer-winning Humboldt's Gift. This is my favorite Bellow novel. This is a Ramona Clef. It's a novel with a key. And essentially this is Bellow's love letter to his friend, I think his name was Ettore Schmitz. And we do see Bellow and his oh so lovely sexist self in here. I believe the main character smacks his wife at one point, and it's kind of passed over. Not necessarily as that everything was hunky dory, but it was not the same way that we would view such an attack today. That said, it's a great first person novel about friendship, male to male friendship. It's a great novel about a man who has something to write and doesn't know how to get it out of his system. And one thing that I want to say that will say more to me, or should say more to you about this novel than anything I can say. What I want to say is that there's a screen treatment in here. Essentially, it's a brief outline in 5 parts of a movie idea. It's outlined, but the script isn't written. It's only about 2 pages. For my own personal writing, I have used that format to structure my stories, and I found it incredible. So, if you're not used to outlining, this is a book that really can help you learn how to write, maybe a little more directly than you would expect. I would give this book an S tier, and yeah, so we'll go with that. After Humboldt's Gift, we have The Dean's December. The Dean's December is not a great novel. It's the most, it's a book the most like Philip Roth of any of his novels. Essentially, a man who's a dean goes with his wife into communist Eastern Europe, and he contemplates a lot of things there. As with a Hemingway, or not a Hemingway, a Henry James novel, we're getting flashbacks, or also such a book as American Pastoral by Roth. Now, these flashbacks are mostly the flashbacks of a man who's clearly incredibly well educated, and he tends to think about some pretty far out stuff. So there's a part in here I don't know how serious Bellow is, honestly, where he starts to claim that maybe the reason crime rates are high in a certain area is because of lead going into the environment. So Bellow was considered oftentimes a more conservative figure in the literary movement, but at least partially concerned with the environmentalism and lead content of rivers, foods, and so on. The book is definitely not a contemporary novel. It's very recent. There are aspects of it that are very much of the moment. Still, at times, it does show that it was written, I believe, in the early 80s. This book I would probably put at a B. After The Dean's December, we have what I think is Bellow's second worst novel, and that is More Die of Heartbreak. More Die of Heartbreak is a first-person narrative that's a bit freewheeling and unconstrained. Essentially, the book is about a new marriage from somebody who is divorced. Bellow was considered a conservative. He's associated with cultural conservatism, is the way you'll see it phrased in Wikipedia. And I don't think it's wholly wrong. Although I myself am not the most conservative person, I would still recommend reading Bellow. I think he's a brilliant writer. That said, there are parts in this book that are concerned with the American Republican Party, or at least the conservatives in America. I can't remember specifically if he's talking about Republicans. And I think that might be a turnoff to some people. I know that book reading crowds often tend to be a little more liberal. So I'm mentioning that this is another book of Bellow's that is a bit of a downturn. But overall, it's it's interesting. I'd say this is probably a C minus, though. It's really something that can be passed over. I read it more recently. It's one of the only books of his that I hadn't read. Most of the books of his, as I said, I've read many years ago. I did some little skimming to make the videos, and I looked some stuff up. But I think I read this 2 years ago, and I found it kind of forgettable. There are certain aspects of it where it's clearly a Bellow novel, and at the same time, there are parts of it where he's not writing at his best. He's not at top caliber. So make of this what you want. More Die of Heartbreak. It's not a terrible read. It's just not. It's not very good. There are many things that are worth your time more than this. Bellow's last novel is called Ravelstein. Like Humboldt's Gift, this is also a monoclef. The novel concerns Alan Bloom. Since this is 2025 and the viewers are likely not old enough to remember who Alan Bloom was, he was an American philosopher and translator who wrote a culture war book called The Closing of the American Mind. It was a very conservative idea. Essentially, Bloom argued that postmodernism type stuff was forcing American minds closed. And while I haven't actually read The Closing of the American Mind, and so I want to not argue its specific points very directly, what I will say is that this book is loved by people who don't typically like Bellow. And one of the reasons I believe that is the case is because Alan Bloom was gay, and this was not known by everybody. And Bellow, after Bloom had died of AIDS, essentially wrote this novel telling us who Alan Bloom really was. And what you'll find in this book is a much more progressive Saul Bellow. And you'll see a figure who is often associated with very conservative ideas was not necessarily the most liberal or left-wing person or progressive, but was simply much, much more complicated than this conservative idea would have people believe. Additionally, in this novel, we see Bellow discussing his religion in a much more concrete and real way than appears in any of his other work. And just in general, what I would say is that this is a great novel. It's funny because I sometimes feel that this is one of the most progressive novels I've read, and that's because it's an AIDS novel. It deals directly with somebody who is going through the illness of AIDS and who ultimately dies of it. And it was written by Saul Bellow, who's often considered a very conservative man. And so I'm not sure what else to say. I would say this is an S-tier novel. So I think we're looking at probably a few of those with Saul Bellow, and maybe that would point to why I wanted to make these videos. The last Bellow that I have is really the end of his fiction, as it is contemporarily collected. Although some of his novellas were printed as individual works, perhaps with a few other stories added when they first came out, now when you buy his short fictions, I think that's the way to get those. Bellow is a Pen Malamud Award winner, which is not a small deal today. In general, the Pen Awards don't tend to carry quite as much weight as they could, but they're certainly not nothing. But when it comes to the short story world, the Pen Malamud is awarded for a writer's oeuvre. It's not just a specific story. And essentially what it's saying is that this writer has made a serious contribution to short fiction. So Bellow won that. What Bellow does is perhaps not totally in style today, but he tends to write very strong characters, and they tend to be mythic in some ways, similar to Philip Roth's The Swede in American Pastoral, or a character by Bernard Malamud. Truthfully, I have not read all of the stories in this collection. I've read about half of them. The one that stands out to me most is The Thief. And the reason that stands out to me is that the protagonist of the the short story or novella really is a broad businesswoman, and to see how Bellow narrates her, you'll see very quickly a parallel between this kind of broad, boisterous businesswoman and a character like Henderson from Henderson the Rain King. It's very interesting, and I definitely think it's worth checking out. In my opinion, as a short story snob, this is probably a B book. So it's not great short fiction. I mean, it's certainly like much better than most of what's out there. But the problem is that it's not exactly in a style that screams contemporary. To conclude everything, it's necessary to rank all of Bellow's books in a coherent way. And we've got 11 here, so I'm going to go through them for you. The first book is Dangling Man. As I said, this is a D or even F showing. This is interesting only to Bellow enthusiasts. We see all Bellow's personal flaws here magnified. There are some things that are interesting, and it's certainly interesting to learn about the military and the way that functions. That said, the flaws are pretty numerous. So we'll give this a D. It is by Bellow after all. You can't very well fail Saul Bellow. Our second book is The Victim. And The Victim will give a B. This is a solid second novel. It's better than his first. And I think it's almost as good as some of his other work. That said, it does have some flaws associated with its earliness. If you're interested in mid-century fiction, simply for its own sake, this is definitely worth reading. Our third book is This Giant Tomb, The Adventures of Augie March. This is an S tier for me. I would consider maybe as low as A+, but I think this is worth every cent of whatever the admission fee costs, if you understand me. It's definitely a great book, and there are all sorts of aspects of mid-century American life that are interesting for history, and as far as the writing goes, there are some parts of excellence. To expect an S-tier book to be truly perfect is a bit unreasonable. So while it does have flaws, in this book they are minimal compared to many of his other books. Or rather, the flaws are not so severe as far as his interpersonal flaws. Next we have Seize the Day. I'm going to give Seize the Day a B. I'm giving it a B mostly out of respect. This book was a bit of a forgettable thing for me. I've heard it compared to J.D. Salinger. If, of course, you're going to be giving either a cousin or a child, not a child, a teenager, Catcher in the Rye, I think that this is a great compliment to it. However, I don't think this is as great as some of the other people would have you believe. It does have up here a Great Books Foundation tag. Those things are awesome. They tend to be fairly obscure works, and works that might otherwise be passed over. It is interesting to read this book. It's just not Bellow's best book. After that, we have Henderson the Rain King. My copy is quite beat up. To be completely honest, this is a copy I got very cheaply. And this is not the copy I read. I read a copy at a school library, but I wanted a copy of Henderson the Rain King, and I liked the cover. Henderson the Rain King is an S tier for me. No questions. It's an S tier. The only flaws that I can think of would not be... He's as equally flawed as a writer like Joseph Conrad in writing Heart of Darkness. Is the book potentially prejudicial? Yes. But compared to many of the other things that are out there and the overall message of the book, I think it's worth reading, and he's definitely tooting the horn of humanity here. He's looking for a brotherhood in Africans. He's not saying that the noble savage, which is kind of a figure, um, is something to be ignored. So does the book have flaws? Yes, but it's quite excellent. After Henderson, the Rain King, we have Herzog. Now I'm torn between an A and an S rating for this. I think I'm going to give this an S rating just because it's Saul Bellow. But that said, if you want a good Bellow, this is a good place to start. It might be a little. It's very clearly from the middle of the century. So there are still some things about how he doesn't like his wife who he's getting divorced from, and there's some alcoholism and so on and so forth. But we do see things that are interesting here. And if you're the type of guy who, or girl, who likes to pontificate when they can and mention the old philosopher or two in those speeches or rants, this is definitely worth your looking into. It's a great book. I've read it twice actually, and I enjoyed it both times. Mr. Sammler's Planet. I'm going to give this a B plus. There are parts of it that I've forgotten, to be completely honest, as I mentioned, and maybe it would be worth checking out again. When you like Bellow, what you tend to latch on to, it seems to me, is the style. And so there's a very American sentence, as Philip Roth says. That's very much present here. The book does have some pretty big flaws with it, but if you sit down and read it from beginning to end, I think you're going to have a good experience. So let's say that this is a B plus. Next, we have Humboldt's Gift. Humboldt's Gift, I'm giving an S, without a doubt. This is probably my favorite Bellow, either this or Ravelstein. I have only read it once. The only one of his books that I've read cover to cover twice is Herzog. But this is a great book. It's got some flaws with it, but if you especially take the time to look into Bellow's relationship with his poet friend who was the inspiration to this book, you'll see that there's a lot of heart in the book. And when you're talking about Bellow, love for humanity and heart are at the forefront of the conversation. The Dean's December is our next Bellow book. I'm going to give this, let's give this a solid B. So this is there are flaws with it. It's not perfect. Certain aspects of the contemplations of the world and its philosophy seem a little hokey now. It was written in the 80s, but it's worth your time. It's not the best book. It's still pretty good. Next, the book that we have is Die of Heartbreak. And this is going to be a C to C minus. So if you're reading all of Bellow, this is worthwhile reading. I feel a bit like saying this is divorced dad literature, but I guess you could say that about Bellow in general. But that's what I would say. I would say that this is a C or a C minus. The last novel that we ranked and that we're going to put a ranking on is Ravelstein. This is his final novel. This is an S tier book. This is the ideal book both for somebody who's interested in Saul Bellow and for somebody who is turned off by many things about Saul Bellow. If you're interested in learning who the writer was that won a Nobel Prize, but other than that you don't care about Saul Bellow, try reading Ravelstein. If you're interested in Saul Bellow and you think you're going to like him, you should probably start with a book like Herzog, but don't write off Ravelstein. Ravelstein is a good early work to read. It's his last novel. Many people who cannot stand Saul Bellow like this book. Bellow's last book of fiction that we looked at was The Collected Stories. As I said, I've read about half the stories in here. I haven't actually read the entirety of the storybook. So there are a few longer stories or novellas that I haven't actually read. I've read most of the novellas, though. The collected stories, we're going to say, is a B. It's not bad. It's certainly short stories that have won a Penn Malamud Award, which was absolutely not a simple thing to accomplish. But the stories are not in line with the contemporary ideas of stories. Bellow is in some ways more minimalistic than we would think him, which is a positive for the way that we view the contemporary American short story. What's not quite in line with the contemporary American short story is his focus on character. He's very concerned with every character he writes, writing this very mythic, exaggerated personality. And it's charming, and if you're like me, you love reading fiction like that. But oftentimes we get dialogue-heavy short stories in the contemporary world, or things that are more focused on an event. We don't tend to focus on mythic characters quite the same way. The last thing that I want to say about Saul Bellow is that he writes about what it means to be an American, and his ideas of what it means to be an American are still relevant today. Although I'm somebody who has many, many different opinions than Saul Bellow, I deeply admire his writing. I think that he's a great writer, and I really kind of wish that more people would read him. I think that if the young men who tend to be disillusioned by the publishing landscape took the time to look into Saul Bellow, they might find somebody that they're interested in. Likewise, I do think that there's some stuff there for women and babies, NBs. I think there's stuff there for everyone. But he does tend to write about male friendship, and he does that exceedingly well. He is somewhat sexist, and that is kind of unavoidable in the writing. There are problems with Saul Bellow. He's not perfect, and sometimes he can write things that could be seen as prejudicial. But on the whole, he's certainly worth checking out. So if you're looking for a mythic figure with very interesting prose, I would recommend Bellow. I'm currently working toward finishing all of Don DeLillo's published novels. I'm on my 15th now of 17, and it's a happy accident, let's say, that I felt compelled to make a Saul Bellow video and discuss Don DeLillo. The novel I'm reading of DeLillo's right now is his first novel, Americana, and I can definitely see an influence there. Another writer of contemporary American fiction who I know has very positive things to say about Bellow is Dennis Johnson. And he wrote Jesus' Son, Tree of Smoke. Another writer, also Jeffrey Eugenides, has spoken glowingly of Bellow. So if you're interested really in most people in the contemporary writing space, Saul Bellow was an influence in some capacity. Alright guys, thanks. That's everything. I've been Mark, and several books out. Bye-bye.